If you worked in corporate America or been just an avid consumer of the news over the last 20 years, you're likely familiar with something called TED Talk. If you're unfamiliar with this term, then it might sound a little strange. These are not talks given by some guy named Ted. No, TED stands for Technology, Entertainment, and Design. And it's an organization that's dedicated to the spreading of ideas. TED centers around its annual TED Conference, where it curates speeches, referred to as TED Talks, on the latest and most groundbreaking ideas from the world's best and brightest minds, people around the world. And as a result, the TED Conference today has become one of the preeminent speaking engagements in the world. To be a presenter at one of these conferences is considered a great achievement and an opportunity to really skyrocket a person's career and bolster their credibility. By the way, if you're interested in going to a TED conference, tickets can be bought online, just like many other tickets, though the standard $10,000 tickets often sell out. But lucky for you, you can still purchase the VIP level tickets. They're often available for the low, low price of $250,000 a ticket, assuming they accept your application, because you can't simply buy a ticket. Even attendees have to apply in order to attend the TED Conference. The list of past speakers for the TED Conference reads like a who's who list of the world's elite and most influential people. You have CEOs, presidents, billionaires, renowned authors, world leaders, and Nobel Prize laureates. Past speakers include people like Bill Clinton, Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, Jane Goodall, David Cameron, Billy Graham, Richard Dawkins, Jeff Bezos, and even Pope Francis, and many other famous figures that you no doubt recognize. I would imagine most of you have listened to a TED Talk or two in your lifetime or heard of one. If you hadn't, you'd likely find some of interest to you on a range of topics, but there's certainly a lot of insightful and interesting presenters. And among these is one author in particular who I've enjoyed reading for the past 20 years or so now. It's a man named Malcolm Gladwell. Perhaps you've heard of him. Since the year 2000, Malcolm Gladwell has written 7 books, 5 of which have been New York Times bestsellers. So he's sold millions upon millions of copies of his books. And still writing today. No doubt he'll come out with another book again before too long. Gladwell was named one of Time magazine's most influential people in 2005. He received the Order of Canada in 2011, which is that nation's second highest civilian honor. And he's been touted as one of foreign policy's top global thinkers. Malcolm Gladwell is known for his careful research, his ability to make connections and draw conclusions that often others have mistaken or misinterpreted. Often he's revealed the reality behind strange data, I guess. Kind of upends things that we take for granted sometimes, or that the intelligentsia does, and he seems to specialize in toppling popular beliefs on things such as crime and success, talent, race, even intelligence. I've often found his ideas pretty insightful from time to time, and so recently I watched one of his TED Talks that I hadn't seen before. And I say one of his TED Talks because he has several. And this TED Talk was interestingly, on the story of David and Goliath, the classic underdog story from the Bible. And it was in this TED Talk that he went on to present some conclusions that seemed to upend the traditional understanding of this story, flipping the interpretation on its head, as it were. In this presentation, he argued that David was not, in fact, the underdog of this story, as it has so often been taught and believed, but that he actually had the upper hand against Goliath. He argues that it was no miracle that the shepherd boy defeated the Philistine giant, but that his victory was almost a foregone conclusion, the second that David chose to bring a sling into combat. To support this idea, he talks about ballistic studies that have demonstrated the effectiveness of the sling, which apparently had the stopping power of a .45 caliber handgun. He references how some Israelite slingers in the Bible were so accurate that they could sling stones at a hair's breadth and not miss. And how David had already proven his proficiency by killing both a lion and a bear with his sling. Gladwell also argues that Goliath was likely only 6'9", and that he likely suffered from a disease called acromegaly, which is a form of gigantism. It's something that had severely impacted Goliath's vision and made him slow and unsteady on his feet. An easy target for someone proficient with a sling, he says. Mr. Gladwell cites scientific studies, shares historical facts, weaves an interesting story that no doubt leaves some convinced that David was no underdog at all, but instead he was this clever shepherd boy who chose a ranged weapon to defeat a Philistine warrior who was armed for hand-to-hand combat. Essentially, Mr. Gladwell not only argues that the miracle of David's victory wasn't miraculous at all, but that David's victory was the much more likely outcome, and that all the soldiers present that day would have predicted this as soon as they saw David wield a sling. He was heavily favored to win this fight. Is this true? Has the traditional understanding of this story truly been so incorrect? Since the Enlightenment, and no doubt prior, scholars have routinely discounted, downplayed, and criticized the miraculous accounts in the Bible, doing whatever they can, really, to prove that the miraculous events in the Bible never happened, or, as in this case, were just not miraculous at all. And these are often arguments made by people with credibility in the scholarly world. People who are educated men and women using science and research to back their conclusions. And how could such respected intellectuals such as that get it wrong? And yet, when their arguments are put to the test, they're found seriously wanting. And often for the most basic reasons. Let's begin by going to Psalms, chapter 119. And we'll start reading in verse 97. Often their reasoning is found wanting for the most basic reasons. Psalm 119:97 says, "Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day. You, through your commandments, make me wiser than my enemies, for they are ever with me. I have more understanding than all my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation." Arguments such as these presented by Mr. Gladwell fall short simply because those presenting them do not carefully meditate on the words in the Bible. They don't study it holistically and think on it regularly and deeply. It is not their constant meditation. Simply put, they just don't carefully study this most important source. Instead, they cherry pick a scripture out of context here. They pull a mistranslated passage there, and they come to these conclusions that might sound reasonable at first, but after careful examination are found to be just wildly off the mark. They come to conclusions like keeping the Sabbath on a Sunday, or the Trinity, or an afterlife in heaven or hell, or the secret rapture, and so many other false beliefs because they do not read the Bible in its entirety and carefully consider the Word of God. But family, we cannot be so shallow, so immature in our approach to the Bible as this. God expects us to think deeply on His words and to make them our constant meditation. God compares the Word of God to a sword that we use to discern the truth. It is the weapon of our spiritual warfare, and as Christian soldiers, we must be well practiced in the use of our sword if we are to defend ourselves from spiritual attack, from false teachings, deceptions, and erroneous arguments. Let's turn to 2 Corinthians. Let's go to 2 Corinthians 10, and we'll start reading in verse 3. 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 3. It says, For though we walk in the flesh, We do not war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God, for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. When we meditate deeply on God's word, it trains our minds to better defend this precious truth, to prove it beyond a doubt, and tear down and destroy arguments that would attack it. And that's what I'd like us to do today. I'd like us to dig carefully into the Bible, to read its words together, and practice this important skill of meditating on its words, of thinking carefully and deeply. I'd like to analyze this argument that Mr. Gladwell puts forth, that he made about David and Goliath as an example for us, as practice. And like the Bereans, I'd like us to examine each of his arguments in light of the Bible and see if they hold up under such scrutiny or if they crumble to pieces. Now, before we dig into specific arguments, it's always good to refamiliarize ourselves with the particulars. And so I'd like to read the story of David and Goliath. So I'd like to turn to 1 Samuel 17. And we'll start reading in verse 1. It's always good to reground ourselves in the words, even with a familiar story such as this. 1 Samuel 17, verse 1. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and the Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley in between. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, 'Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us.' And the Philistines said, 'I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together.' And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." Skipping down to verse 16. "And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his son David, 'Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them.' Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked to them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him with the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel.' And then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, 'What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?' The people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. Skipping again to verse 31. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose against me, I caught it by its beard, and struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor, and he tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. And so David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and with his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. And so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah rose and shouted, and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. So with all that context, the first argument we're going to look at that Malcolm Gladwell made about David and Goliath was that Goliath was only 6'9". He was only 6'9". And you have a handout for reference too. I'm not going to refer to it, but I want to put it there because I'm going to be throwing a lot of numbers at you. Hopefully it'll help keep things straight. But he argued that Goliath was only 6'9". Now, I've met people that tall before. I think Ryland's almost that tall. And I imagine you have met people that tall too, but I wouldn't call them a giant. Would you? You got a lot of NBA basketball players out there, and they're tall, but I wouldn't call them a giant. Don't get me wrong, 6'9", that's tall. Certainly, but not what I'd call a giant. So where does Mr. Gladwell come up with that figure, that 6'9" figure? Well, let's look again here in 1 Samuel 17:4. That's where he gets it. He says, in 1 Samuel 17:4, a champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. He was 4 cubits and a span tall. Okay, so when you multiply 4 cubits in a span by common 18-inch cubit, you get 6 feet and 9 inches for Goliath's height. But wait, you're thinking, my Bible says Goliath's height was 6 cubits and a span. Well, that's because the translation I just read was from the International Standard Version of the Bible, a version that favors the biblical texts from the Greek Septuagint scripts. Whereas you likely have a different version in front of you, like an RSV or New King James, most likely. And in God's church, we typically consider the translations that these come from, the Hebrew Masoretic texts, to be more reliable in general. But how can we be sure which translation of the verse is accurate? Do we all need to be biblical scholars to answer the simple question of how tall Goliath was? Do we need to be able to prove that the Masoretic texts are better than the Septuagint texts? Do we have to read ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew? No, I don't believe so. As is so often the case, seeming discrepancies or confusion in the Bible can be resolved by reading elsewhere in the Bible. And I believe we can confidently deduce that Goliath was 6 cubits and a span tall, not 4 cubits and a span. And let's start doing that. Let's go to 1 Samuel 9 and verse 1. I think we can show this. 1 Samuel 9, starting in verse 1. It says, "There was a man of Benjamin, whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Becherath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a choice and handsome son, whose name was Saul. There's not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people." So out of the millions of Israelites in his day, King Saul was by far the tallest. As we read here, the next tallest Israelite after Saul only came up to his shoulders. From his shoulders upwards, he was taller than any of the people. Now I measured from the top of my head to the top of my shoulders. It's 12 inches, though this would be proportionately higher on Saul, maybe more than 12 inches, but on me it's 12. So the question then becomes, how tall was King Saul? Well, we can say at least 12 inches taller than the next tallest Israelite. And so we ask, how tall was the next tallest Israelite? Well, the Bible doesn't say. Can't answer that question specifically, but we can make an educated guess using some statistics and based on the size of Israel's population at the time. Now, we won't take time to read these passages, but for your notes, you can write them down. If you look at 1 Chronicles 21, it's 1 Chronicles 21, and 2 Samuel 24. 2 Samuel 24 for your notes. And these are the two accounts of David's census of Israel, which occurred maybe 30 or 40 years after the David and Goliath battle. And in this census, he found that Israel had roughly 1.5 million men of fighting age. 1.5 million men. So based on that, the most current statistics that we have from the U.S. Census Bureau is that 1 in 400 men between the age of 20 and 40, fighting age, is 6'6" or taller. And that's the tallest height they tracked. They didn't tell us how many people were 6'7", 6'8", so on. They just lumped everybody 6'6" or taller into the same category. But 1 in 400. And so if we use those numbers with David's census numbers, then David would have had 3,750 men in his army that were 6'6" or taller. Quite a few of them. Now, using that estimate, it seems reasonable that the second tallest man in Israel would have at least been 6'6", maybe even 7 feet, who knows? But you'd think that'd be a reasonable conclusion. However, a lot of scholars argue today that ancient peoples were, on average, about 3 inches shorter than we are today, so let's just estimate on the low end with a 6'6", second tallest Israelite. Seems reasonable, right? So by these estimates, King Saul would have been over 7'6". Which brings us to our point. Saul would have been much taller than a 6'9" Goliath. He would have been taller. If he's 7'6", then he's 9 inches taller than Mr. Gladwell's estimates for Goliath. Wouldn't that make Saul the giant? Wouldn't that make Saul the one everyone should be afraid of? And yet, we read earlier in Samuel 17 how all the Israelites and Saul ran in great fear of Goliath whenever he came forward to challenge them. Why would Saul be afraid? He was the tallest man in Israel by a long shot. What's more, he was a battle-hardened veteran who fought wars with Israel's enemies on every side for decades. And he did so against incredible odds, at times when he was armed with nothing more than farm implements. All of his army had nothing but farm implements. Only him and Jonathan had a sword, but Saul fought anyways. Why would King Saul, a man of such courage, be so afraid to fight just one man who was 9 inches shorter than him? For that matter, why would the entire Israelite army be so deathly afraid of a 6'9" warrior? To the point that they would flee from his presence, quote, greatly afraid, as we just read in one verse, and, quote, dreadfully afraid, as it says in another. And they did so for 40 days, in the morning and in the evening. 80 times they ran away from this guy. Statistically speaking, like we just saw, there would have been other warriors in Israel's army around 6'9" tall. And yet, these soldiers of similar stature were not only dreadfully afraid to fight Goliath one-on-one, but they fled from him en masse with everybody else. Does that make sense? Now, why would Saul's son Jonathan, also here, a man who demonstrated incredible courage against the Philistine just 3 chapters prior to what we read, the gentleman who single-handedly attacked and defeated 20 Philistine warriors by himself, 20, not one, why would he be afraid to fight one tall Philistine? A man, Jonathan also, who had great faith in God and demonstrated it. Also consider that in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 25, it says that Saul would give great riches and his daughter's hand in marriage, the hand of a princess in marriage, to the man who defeated Goliath. And tax exemption for him and his entire family. How would you like that? Why would Saul offer such wealth and power to a man who defeated one 6'9" warrior? And then why wouldn't somebody take him up on that offer? Does it make sense that Goliath was only 6'9"? Reading through this account. One last item to consider about Goliath's height, or rather, one last collection of items to consider. Let's read starting in verse 5 of 1 Samuel 17. Probably want to keep a bookmark here. We're coming back to it often. 1 Samuel 17:5 says that Goliath had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had a bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. So Goliath's mail shirt alone weighed 5,000 bronze shekels. In modern terms, that equals approximately 150 pounds. 150 pounds just for the armor on his chest, nothing else. Add in the rest of his armor, his shield, his sword, his spear, his javelin, and you're probably looking at 250 pounds of armaments. 250 pounds. If Goliath was 6'9", then he likely would have weighed between 200 and 300 pounds, somewhere in there. If the Philistine army had the same active duty fitness requirements as the U.S. military, a 6'9" Goliath would have been no more than 235 pounds. So in any case, he would have been carrying approximately his weight, his own weight, in arms and armor into a duel to the death. Does that add up? Would you carry someone your same size in a duel to the death on your back? However, if you consider all these same factors that we covered, all these details that we just covered, with the assumption that Goliath was 9 feet and 9 inches tall, or perhaps taller, and that's how tall he would have been if we used the 6 cubit and a span measurement, and again estimate a cubit as 18 inches, 9 feet and 9 inches tall. Now that would be over 2 feet taller than our estimate for King Saul, and a full 4 feet taller than your average 5'9" male today. 4 feet taller than the average guy in this room. Now that's a size that we could see causing the reactions that we read about in the Bible. At this height, the average Israelite would have come up to Goliath's belt buckle. From Goliath's perspective, the Israelite soldiers would appear like first-grade boys do to the average adult male. Or, as the Israelite spies said in Numbers 13:33, when they saw the giants in Canaan, they said, "We were like grasshoppers in our own sight," and so we were in their sight. No, a 9'9" Goliath is the sort of person that we could see striking fear into the hearts of an army, of an entire army. That's a stature worthy of the name giant. Defeating a man such as that would be worthy of King Saul's prize of great riches in the hand of a princess in marriage. It would have made sense that defeating such a giant would bring a person great renown, so that others even wrote songs about him. You know, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. At that 9'9" figure, that's still using the ratio for a small cubit, the 18-inch cubit. That's the low estimate for Goliath's actual height. It's possible that the cubit used here in the Bible was a 20-inch cubit, which would have meant that Goliath was 10 feet and 10 inches tall. We don't know for sure. It could have truly been just massive. But when we stop and meditate on the words of this story and look at all the facts around it here in our Bible, it becomes very apparent that these verses only make sense if Goliath was truly a giant of a man. Let's continue to the second argument presented in this TED Talk. And that was that Goliath was not a mighty warrior. Goliath was not a mighty warrior. And to be fair, those are not Mr. Gladwell's exact words that he uses, but that is essentially what his argument equates to when his points are summarized together. So let me explain. Malcolm Gladwell argues that Goliath had a childhood affliction called pituitary acromegaly, which is more commonly referred to as gigantism. Basically, this means that Goliath would have had a benign tumor here on his pituitary gland that caused him to produce excessive amounts of human growth hormone. This explained his extreme height then, or would explain his extreme height, as pituitary acromegaly has caused people to grow over 8 feet tall. Hence also why it's called gigantism. I think the gentleman in the Guinness Book of World Records, he was 8'11", and that was why he was that tall, because he had that affliction. Mr. Gladwell then makes the argument that the biblical account showed Goliath to be suffering from some of the adverse symptoms of gigantism, which include double vision, because when David approached him, having a single stick in his hand, a staff, Goliath said, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" Sticks plural. As in, he was seeing more than one that was actually there. He concludes that that was double vision. He also makes the argument that Goliath's shield bearer was actually an attendant that needed to escort Goliath down the slope to the valley of Elah because of the symptoms of Goliath's condition, which could have included extremely poor vision, muscle weakness, fatigue, shortness of breath, and dizziness. In other words, Goliath was not a mighty warrior, not the mighty warrior he was chalked up to be. He was a slow-moving, clumsy man of poor health who had double vision, needed to be escorted onto the battlefield. It was as if the Philistines were simply trying to trick the Israelites into thinking he was a mighty warrior merely because of his size. But do the facts in the Bible support these arguments? What happens when we look at these? Let's look at 1 Samuel 17 and verse 32. 1 Samuel 17:32, then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." King Saul knew who Goliath was. He knew a little of his background. He knew him to have been a warrior from his youth, not a tall, clumsy invalid. Goliath was a known entity to the Israelites, not some surprise dog and pony show that the Philistines would trot out to scare an opposing army. And that makes sense, really. I mean, if you were the Philistines, wouldn't you want your enemies, the Israelites, to know that you had a super weapon? You know, something that you can use to intimidate your enemies and make them think twice about messing with you. Kind of like how Israel doesn't say they have nuclear weapons, but everybody knows they got them. Keeps everybody else from messing with them too much. Or likewise, back in the Cold War days, you see the parades in the USSR with the big ICBMs moving down the street. Don't mess with us. We got super weapons. Canaan was known as a land of giants. The Anakim and the Rephaim. Israel had been fighting these giants off and on since before they entered the Promised Land. King Og of Bashan across the Jordan, he was a giant. In Joshua 11, 21, and 22, we're told that Caleb and Joshua drove the last of the Canaanite giants out of Israel. And interestingly, the remnant of them had fled to the cities of the Philistines, including Gath, where Goliath came from. The Israelites had long been acquainted with giants, and Saul seems to have been well aware of who Goliath was and what he was capable of. Let's also take note of a couple other items. This is in 1 Samuel 17, verse 8. It says, "Then he, Goliath, stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, 'Why have you come out to the line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us.'" So, question for you. If you were considering the odds of this duel, how certain would you need to be about the outcome for you to bet your freedom on it? I know it's something we really like down in Texas. How certain would you need to be to bet your freedom on it? For you to risk going into slavery under the mastery of your nation's mortal enemies? That's what Goliath and the Philistines were doing. How certain would you need to be to make that same wager? Would you be willing to risk everything if the odds were 60% in your favor? What if it was 80%? 95%? Would you be willing to bet your life and liberty and the life and liberty of your family, your friends, and your nation on the chances that an abnormally tall, clumsy man with poor eyesight and 250 pounds of armament weighing him down would defeat the Israelites' best soldier in battle? I know I wouldn't. I don't like those odds. But that said, perhaps the Philistines simply had no intention of honoring the terms of this agreement. Maybe they figured it was worth the gamble because they never really intended to follow through on their promise and figured, hey, if Goliath lost, that they'd just attack Israel and win the battle the hard way. That's what they walked all the way here for anyways, right? Well, let's start reading again in 1 Samuel 17, in verse 51. Breaking into the middle of verse 51, it says, "And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah rose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron." So why did the Philistines flee? Why? They held the high ground on the other side of the valley. They're up here. Israelites are up here. You got to come down the valley and fight up the hill. So their bluff with the tall invalid didn't pay off. Oh well, guess we duke it out the hard way with the Israelites. That's why we marched here all the way, after all. But no, they ran. They abandoned a defensible position on top of a mountain, which they'd occupied for 40 days without even attempting to fight. They ran for their lives for 14 miles back to the city of Ekron. They ran in response to a shepherd boy killing just one of their warriors. How is it possible this event would cause such panic unless Goliath had truly been a massive and mighty warrior? Someone they had put all their confidence in, their super weapon. And now their super weapon was dead, and their courage was shattered by a teenager with a sling. No, when we carefully examine and meditate on the words here in the Bible, this idea that Goliath was a tall invalid just doesn't ring true. Let's move on to a third argument then that Mr. Gladwell made about this story. And that is that David had the clear advantage in this battle. That David had the advantage in this battle. Why? Because he chose a sling as his weapon. Malcolm Gladwell argues that the moment David chose to bring a sling to fight Goliath, that the battle was essentially over. In his own words, he said that when David chose to fight with a sling, quote, "At that point, no one watching from the ridges on either side of the valley would have considered David's victory improbable. David was a slinger, and slingers beat infantry hands down." So to explain this conclusion, Gladwell talks about how ancient warfare, in its simplest terms, can be broken down into a game of rock, paper, scissors. He says that the typical army contained infantrymen on foot with short-range weapons, horsemen, and then ranged fighters, such as slingers. Horsemen beat ranged fighters because they were too hard to hit moving as fast as they did. They just run down the ranged guys. Infantrymen beat horses because they had long spears to break any cavalry charge. And ranged soldiers, such as slingers, beat infantrymen because they could fling missiles at them from a distance and the infantry had no way to return fire. So, like rock, paper, scissors, infantry beats cavalry, cavalry beats slingers, slingers beat infantry. David was a slinger, and Goliath was infantry, so David wins. Sounds pretty straightforward. Additionally, Mr. Gladwell talks about some recent studies that have been done demonstrating how effective of a weapon the sling could be. Multiple studies have actually shown that a sling can fling a projectile so hard that it has similar stopping power of a .45 caliber handgun. Also, Mr. Gladwell also points out a verse in the Bible, actually turn to the Bible, that talks about how accurate Israelite slingers could be. And let's turn there, actually. Let's go to Judges 20 and verse 15. Judges chapter 20 and verse 15. It says, "And from their cities at that time the children of Benjamin numbered 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who numbered 700 select men. Among all this people were 700 select men who were left-handed. Every one could sling a stone at a hair's breadth and not miss." All right, so based on all this information, Mr. Gladwell concludes that, quote, "Goliath had as much chance against David as any Bronze Age warrior with a sword would have had against an opponent armed with a .45 automatic pistol." Now, I'm sure he meant semi-automatic, but he said automatic. And that sounds convincing, doesn't it? But does this argument hold up when we meditate on the facts of the Bible? Let's start by addressing his rock, paper, scissors idea about ancient warfare. Was it in fact so obvious that a slinger would defeat any infantryman? But every soldier watching this duel, as he said, between David and Goliath had predicted David's victory the moment that he pulled out a sling, as Gladwell claims. Let's turn to 1 Samuel 14 and verse 47 to begin addressing this. 1 Samuel 14 and verse 47. It says, "So Saul established his sovereignty over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the people of Ammon, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he harassed them. And he gathered an army and attacked the Amalekites and delivered Israel from the hands of those who plundered them." Jumping to verse 52. Now there was a fierce war with the Philistine all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him for himself. What are we reading here? We just read here how Saul had fought in many wars with all the nations on every side, every border Israel had. He fought wars with those nations. And he spent the entirety of his reign fighting the Philistines in particular. So clearly, he was a very experienced warrior and general of his day. He was very successful one at that as well. Very successful. Now, let's turn back to 1 Samuel 17. Put that in context. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 38. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on David's head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor, and he tried to walk, for he had not tested them. Saul, what are you doing? Give David a sling. Give him a bow. Give him a javelin. What are you doing giving this inexperienced youth a sword and armor to fight close range with? Don't you know that you need a ranged weapon to defeat an infantryman? Rock beats scissors. Why wasn't this obvious fact so obvious to King Saul, the warrior king of Israel? And wait, why wasn't this super obvious to every other Israelite soldier? Goliath stepped forward every morning and every evening for 40 days to challenge and insult the Israelites. Weren't there other slingers among them? We read earlier how incredibly accurate Israelite slingers could be. Weren't there any of those kind of slingers around in those 40 days? Why didn't one of them step forward? Kill this champion from a safe distance oh so easily and claim all the honors and riches that King Saul was promising. Seems like a pretty good payday. Were they too honorable to fight a man from a distance? Was that somehow breaking the rules of duels like these, maybe? Well, it certainly doesn't seem that way, because the Philistines didn't cry foul when David attacked Goliath with a sling. And likewise, David was sung about and praised for years to come for his great victory over Goliath, not scolded for breaking the rules of engagement or shrugged at because it was so easy to win this fight with a sling. Looking at the rest of the story, this whole rock, paper, scissors analogy of ancient warfare just isn't supported. No one in the record of that day acted in a way that would support this idea, and in fact, quite the opposite. King Saul tried to give David his own armor and sword so he could fight close range. No other Israelite slingers chose to fight Goliath. They ran from him in fear, just like all their other compatriots. And then the Philistines fled for their lives after David killed Goliath. Now, clearly, this wasn't a simple matter of rock beats scissors. So what about the argument then that Goliath had as much chance against David and his sling as he did against someone armed with a 45? Let's start by looking at 1 Samuel 17 and verse 49. It says here, "Then David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth." Now, there have been some rigorous ballistic studies, actually. Read some papers on that for this message. And studies that actually have been done on ancient sling weapons. At least one of them was actually specifically focused on the David and Goliath story. And based on the results of these tests, which they performed on cadavers, in order for a sling stone to become lodged in someone's forehead, like we read about there with Goliath, David would have needed to be approximately 90 feet away so that it would have enough force to have that kind of impact behind it. And that stone would have to be average size of like 50 to 90 grams, I guess. So according to these tests done on cadavers, at the point of impact, the sling bullet would have needed to be flung from the sling pocket at about 115 feet per second to get that kind of damage. That's how fast it would have to go, 115 feet per second. By comparison, a .45 caliber handgun fires a bullet at a velocity 6 to 8 times faster than this. Being much smaller and more aerodynamic than a stone, a .45 caliber bullet travels much farther and penetrates much deeper on impact. A sling just doesn't even begin to compare to a .45 caliber handgun. You don't need to swap it out. And that's why armies frankly stopped using slings a long time ago in favor of bows and arrows, because they also cause a lot more damage than a sling does. Going back to our sling research, I mentioned that the experiment showed that David would have needed to be at least 90 feet away from Goliath in order to get that kind of hit. It's a very comfortable distance from a sword and a spear. But Goliath wasn't simply armed with a sword and a spear. As we read, he also carried a javelin, a throwing spear. The world record for the javelin toss is over 340 feet. A whole lot more than 90. It was thrown by a man who would have stood at least 3 feet shorter than Goliath. A 90-foot throw would have been easy for Goliath. And how accurate would this champion of the Philistines have been with his weapons? Their best warrior, whom they had all bet their freedom on. How proficient would he have been with his weapons? Additionally, how much more deadly is a sharpened, bronze throwing spear flung by a giant at a boy without armor than a round stone flung at a giant wielding a shield specifically made to block such projectiles and wearing 200 pounds of bronze armor? Armor that was also crafted specifically to protect against such projectiles. Goliath could hit David just about anywhere with his javelin toss. And with its sharp point and mass, it likely just would have gone straight through him, incapacitating or even just killing David outright. David could only hope to defeat Goliath by hitting him precisely where he did, right here. A hit on Goliath's armor would only have bruised him, maybe just bounced off. No, David had to hit a target from 90 feet away that was no larger than the size of a person's hand. And potentially smaller, because we don't know what style of helmet Goliath was wearing. For all we know, he would have had those nose pieces coming down like this. Could have been an even smaller target than that. More so, is it logical to think that Goliath was remaining still for David, like some straw bale target? Just holding still. No. In fact, the Bible tells us he arose and came and drew near David. He was a moving target. Why would he stand still? After all, he knows what a sling is. He's been a warrior since his youth. He knows what it can do, and he also knows where he's vulnerable to it. Just here. And why wouldn't he raise his shield to block an incoming projectile? That's what the shield is for, after all. It's likely why Goliath's shield bearer walked out in front of him on the field to begin with, to prevent this very thing from happening, and block an attack by a bunch of slingers or something. He was there to help fend that kind of thing off. All right, just one last thought on this point. Have you ever wondered how fast Goliath was, being as tall as he was? The world's fastest man, Usain Bolt, he ran the 100-meter in less than 10 seconds. At that speed, he would run 90 feet in 2.6 seconds. Wow. Goliath was at least 3 feet taller than Usain Bolt. With proportionately longer stride, though, he also carried his 250 pounds of armor with him. But despite this, how fast could he run and be within spear range of David? 6 seconds? 4? So to summarize, in order to defeat Goliath, David had to essentially do the following. He had to hit a moving target the size of a human hand or smaller, that's 90 feet away and protected by a shield. He has maybe 5 seconds to do this and only gets 1, maybe 2 attempts. And this all assumes that Goliath just doesn't kill David with his javelin before David's even within range. All Goliath has to do was protect his face with a shield, block a couple stones, run at David, and take one swing at his unarmored body with his sword or spear, or again, just hit David with that javelin once he was within range. Put in that light, doesn't it make sense that no other Israelite dared to step forward? That King Saul would offer such a great reward for anyone who would defeat Goliath. Doesn't it make sense that the Israelites fled from Goliath and get out of range of that javelin? And that the Philistines then fled in fear after David killed him? Isn't it reasonable that the Israelites sang and danced in the streets to celebrate and praise David's victory? No one that day thought that David was going to win this contest. No one but David. And that only because he trusted in God's deliverance. Not because he thought himself mightier than Goliath or such a cool hand with a sling. The story is recorded in the Bible not because it was some unremarkable event with a predictable outcome, but just the opposite. The odds were stacked so heavily against David that his victory was only made possible through God's intervention. God's deliverance for this young man who dared to put his life on the line when so many others wouldn't, stepped out in faith and courage to fight for his Creator. Family, the point of my message today wasn't to tear down Mr. Gladwell. I hope I didn't come across as derisive or proud as we picked apart his arguments. I didn't prepare this message so I could beat up on this man in his TED Talk. I gave it really just to make just one point. And that point's neatly summarized in 1 Thessalonians 5, in verse 21. Please turn with me there to 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 21. It says simply this, it says, test all things, hold fast what is good. When arguments challenge our beliefs, we should follow the advice of these 8 little words. In this world, people belittle the Bible. They downplay and discount its miracles. They deny its veracity. They claim it's disproved by science, by history, by the fossil record, and whatever else. But when you take their arguments and put them to the test, time and again they crumble. When we hear arguments that give us pause, we should put those arguments to the test. We should hold them up to the truth of the Bible and reveal whether they're good and something that we should hold fast to, or whether they are false and something that gets cut to ribbons by the sword of truth. And though, more often than not, arguments that challenge a belief of ours are false, there are times when those arguments are proven right. It's something we personally should accept and adjust our beliefs to. This is what the Bereans did when they first heard Paul's teachings. They listened, and then they analyzed his arguments against the Bible, and finding them to be true, they embraced them. And likewise, we need to be critical in our analysis, but still humble to accept correction at times, because our understanding is not perfect individually. We can grow in the grace of the knowledge of God if we are wise to listen to correction as well, especially among our brethren. Iron sharpens iron, after all. Let's just read one last verse in 1 Corinthians. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 1, in verse 26. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 26. For you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised, God has chosen. And the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. But of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, and righteousness, and sanctification, and redemption, that, as it is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. Family, we have a special calling which so few people in this world do. So few. We have an understanding of the Bible that confounds even the most wise people in this world, most knowledgeable. As we've seen today, it's incredible just how little even brilliant people can misinterpret and misunderstand the Bible. I think it'd be so clever and insightful about so many other things in this world, and yet be so far off the mark when it comes to God's truth, because they're deceived by Satan, who deceives the whole world. They haven't been called at this time, but you and I have been called out of that deception. There's no achievement of our own. We have this special understanding of God's word that we should understand something better than the wise of this world. It's the gift of God to us, the weak things of this world. Those who would otherwise be deceived just like everyone else. So treasure this precious truth that you've had your mind open to. Meditate on it constantly. Deepen your understanding of it. And always remember those 8 little words. Test all things. Hold fast what is good.